All right. First off, I just want to thank everyone for coming out again to our, or not again, but for joining us for our second town hall. We were absolutely overwhelmed by the response for our first town hall and are very excited to be hosting a second one. So thanks everyone for coming from all over the place. It's very exciting. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tara Russell, and I am the program director for CPAW's Northern Alberta chapter, and I'm going to be your MC for the night. I'm one of your back-end Zoom coordinators for the evening. I am joined tonight by my colleagues Taylor Maton, Chris Smith, Becky Burswizzle, and Steve Donnellan, who are all helping out and are going to be some of your presenters for the evening. I'm just going to quickly cover a few housekeeping items before we get started. So because there are so many people joining on the call, everyone's going to be on mute. This makes it a lot easier for us. And so we're going to also request that you keep your video turned off just to minimize the amount of bandwidth that this is taking for everybody. As I noted, we've switched the chat box, so you're only going to be able to chat to myself or the other hosts, and this is going to help us minimize distractions and also keep track of those questions. So that being said, if at any time during the presentation you have any questions, just type them in the chat box, and we are going to be taking those and holding them to the end where we're going to have a Q&A session with our presenters. As well, if you have any technical issues or quick questions at all, just shoot them in there and one of us will try to answer those for you as best we can. We are going to have one interactive poll during the session. This will pop up on your screen and prompt you to answer multiple choice. You can do this, it's anonymous, but we do share the overall results with everybody. So if you don't feel like it, don't participate, totally fine. I'm sure I don't have to say this, but any disruptions or inappropriate comments at all during the meeting will result in that person just being removed and not let back in. So just keep it kind out there. And finally, if you want to post to social media about any of this, please use the hashtag #DefendAVParks. We're just kind of keeping track of the interactions. So a quick overview of the agenda. Did our housekeeping. Chris Smith is our parks coordinator. He's going to be giving an overview of the issue. We are then going to move into a deep dive on the delisting of the parks, park partnerships, and the issues with the consultation on this from Steve Donnellan, who is the chair of the CPAW's Northern Alberta Board. We're going to hear some perspective from Recreation Representative Christine O'Reilly from the Alpine Club of Canada. And then Becky is going to give us a rundown on how you can participate in helping us stop the removal of our provincial parks from the park system. And so Becky will help you engage further on that. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So on that, you may already know that this is being hosted by the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta chapters. We're a nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to the protection of wilderness and wildlife across Canada. And here in Alberta, we have two local chapters. So one operating in Southern Alberta, based out of Calgary, and one in Northern Alberta, based out of Edmonton, working on local conservation issues. So we are jointly hosting this town hall because we're super concerned about the changes to Alberta parks. In early March, the government of Alberta announced that they'll be removing 164 park sites from the park system and closing 20 parks. And so tonight we're hoping to unpack that a little further. So to start us off, we have Chris Smith, who will be giving you an overview, and I will hand it over to him.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Smith. Thanks so much for the introduction to all this, Tara. As Tara mentioned, I'm the Parks Coordinator with CPAW's Northern Alberta chapter. And I will be giving a quick overview of sort of the situation that's at hand, what's been announced, And I will be following it in the format of a document that we released called 13 Truths and a Lie about the announced changes to Alberta parks. So basically, it lists 13 relevant facts about these changes, and then kind of goes into what you can do. Some of these facts I will be only very briefly mentioning, as other presenters will be going into much more detail. This is meant to just be a very quick overview. So, 13 truths and a lie. The first fact is that the parks will have their protected area status removed. This comes right from the announcement from Alberta Parks. And taking right from there is that sites removed from the park system will have their legal parks designations removed, and that some sites could also stay open under a public lands management model or revert back to public land. So this is one of those ones where Steve will be going into more detail on this later in the presentation, so I won't get into it too much. The second fact on the sheet, and just so you know, this all of these facts as well as all the supporting information is available on our website, and we can make that link available to anybody who is interested. But just so you know that if you do want to look up this information, it is all cited and sourced from where it did come from. So fact number 2 is that the sites removed from the park system will have their legal park designations removed and could be open to alternative management approaches. So basically what this means is that if the government is not able to secure a third-party partner to manage these sites, the land will revert back to vacant public land. Essentially what this means, vacant public land, you can more or less conduct any sort of activity that you could on, or apply to conduct any sort of activity that you would be able to on any other part of public land. This can include anything from mining, surface mineral extraction like gravel, commercial forestry activities, new oil and gas developments, cultivation, commercial facilities such as resorts, hotels, golf courses, and any number of other alternative management sort of things that other than a park. The third fact is that 37% of parks in Alberta will be impacted. This sometimes confuses some people, as in the government release, they indicate that only 0.3% of Alberta parks will be impacted. The reason for these two different numbers is that the government's value, 0.3%, refers to the total amount of land area that is being affected by these changes. So there's essentially 164 parks that will be impacted out of a total of 473 parks. And that number, 37%, is the one that is being referred to here. So it's not the total land area, it's the actual individual number of sites themselves, which is the 37%. And how this breaks down is that 74% of these are provincial recreation areas, about 1/5 are provincial parks, and about 7% are natural areas, these all being different types of parks within the system. So number 4, the majority of Albertans do not support this announcement. And why we know this is false is that we had polling conducted from March 12th to 16th of this year, and it showed that almost 7 in 10 Albertans oppose the closure or removals of these parks from the park system. Ooh, one second here. What was interesting was that this was relatively consistent across different regions, so Central Alberta, Northern, Southern Alberta, age groups, education levels, and income. There was small differences between those groups. Overall, every one of them showed a majority were against this particular announcement. Number 5, 10 sites will be closed to public access. So this is, or according to the government statement, 10 sites are slated for full closure, where the entire site will be closed to public access. An additional 10 sites are slated for partial closures, where remaining park areas will be open to public access, but will be unserviced. Essentially what this means for the first 10 is that there is no public access gate on the front. You shouldn't be accessing it as a park. The 10 that are slated for partial closure will basically still be accessible to the public, but unserviced, which means anything with a door will be locked, any toilets, outhouses, and garbage cans will not be emptied. So basically there is no government services maintaining those sites. And those have gone into effect as of the announcement. So those sites are currently closed or partially closed. So number 6, parks facilities and assets will be sold and management authority transferred to third parties. So I won't get too much into this one. Steve will be covering this off in more detail, but basically it's not the land itself that is being sold. The land will remain Crown land. However, the facilities and assets will be sold to third parties. Number 7, and this is sort of along a similar vein as number 6, but the transferring to third-party partnerships is different than existing facility operator agreements or facility operating agreements already in place in some provincial campgrounds. So some people may know that we do currently have some campgrounds that are privately managed. However, what is being proposed under these changes is different than those existing facility operating agreements. And again, Steve will be going into more detail on that particular one in his portion of the presentation. So number 8, this will not save us money. So according to the government, these changes will amount to a savings of approximately $5 million from the budget. The Alberta budget for 2020, and this data perhaps might change a bit with how COVID is going, but the budget for 2020 when it was released was $56 billion. $5 million of that is only 0.0089% of total budget expenditures. According to particular studies, it's been shown that for every dollar governments invest in parks in Canada, there is $6 generated back into the gross domestic product. Just from back of the napkin math, this far outweighs the minor savings for those sites than what the government believes will be saved by shuttering these or by selling them off. And at the same time, it's curious where the government is obtaining the $5 million valuation. And this kind of gets back into the consultation aspect of things. It would be great to kind of see how the government came about determining these cost savings, because some of the sites that are on the list have no infrastructure and have no government employees that visit them. So I'm curious exactly how much some of those areas are really costing the government. Alberta Parks fact check number 9. Parks are not for profit. So the value of parks and recreation areas is much greater than the direct government revenue alone. Parks have immeasurable value across quite a wide different range of values. Everything from health and recreation, so contributing to our health and quality of life, providing opportunities to go outdoors, in some cases providing key ecosystem services such as clean water, corridor, or habitat. And also just generally, Albertans love their parks. They love their natural areas. A lot of reasons people live in Alberta is because of the proximity to such amazing outdoor experiences. Those experiences should be available to everybody. It's a public good for us to be able to appreciate the land that is our province. And as such, and as a government good, these parks shouldn't be being run for profit. No different than, say, a public library should be run for profit. Number 10, the announcement is contrary to the intent of Travel Alberta's 10-year tourism strategy. So in the latest budget, the Alberta government stated that they have a goal to double tourism revenue by 2030. and to diversify the areas that Albertans and tourists are visiting. This plan, which would remove 2/5 of all of our parks, doesn't seem like it would help diversify where people are going in Alberta. A lot of people complain that our so-called crown jewels, our Kananaskis and the national parks, are always overcrowded and that people struggle to already access them. By eliminating 40%, roughly 40% of our parks estate, it doesn't seem like it's a very good strategy for, one, doubling tourism, especially when the outdoors is one of Alberta's greatest draws, but two, trying to diversify where those people are going. And the fact that the government wants to divest these sites and focus on their crown jewel parks doesn't seem to support that goal either. Number 11, these areas are not all underused and no usage data has been released. So slight background on myself, I was a park ranger in some of the areas where sites are being removed, and I know there is no day usage statistics that are kept, and there's no, in a lot of cases, not even the full picture of overnight accommodations is captured in the statistics that the government keeps. So with how spotty and generally in poor state the usage data is currently for our parks, again, it would be interesting to see the data that the government used to determine whether a site was underutilized or not. Personally, I've been to a number of these sites while patrolling that have had quite a high rate of usage. And so again, it's curious that some sites that, and I'm sure people on this webinar could also think of one or two sites that do have quite high usage that have somehow found their way onto the list of quote unquote underutilized. Number 12, the announcement was made without any public consultation. Basically, these changes were introduced without any transparent decision-making or consultation with Albertans, contrary to the commitments made by the government to increase transparency and consultation on these types of land use decisions. And number 13, the government in Alberta does sell public land. While the environment minister has come on record stating that these lands will not be sold, these lands being the parklands, the government is moving forward with the sale of public lands in other areas of the province. Notably, one that was in the news was down in southern Alberta, a small parcel of native grasslands that was sold at auction. So even if the government is saying, well, these sites won't be sold right off, there's nothing saying that within 5-10 years that these lands that have been divested and removed from the parks legislation and protections that's afforded from that, these sites easily could be divested in the future for other or for sale to private entities. And and that is it. And I will hand it off to Steve Donnellan to go into some more depth on some of these topics.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate you sharing all of that with everybody. So next up, we are going to have the CPAWS Northern Alberta Board Chair, Steve Donnellan, do a deeper dive on a couple of those points, which is wonderful. We've had a lot of great questions about some of them in the chat box. Just again, a quick reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions as we go, please send them to me. I'm the one that you can chat with in the chat box, and I am keeping all of those questions so that we can ask all of our speakers them at the end. So off to you, Steve.
Great, thanks, Tara. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Great. Welcome. It's great to see such a good crowd tonight, especially with this great weather. It was beautiful here in Edmonton today, and I assume it was pretty much everywhere else in Western Canada as well. And I know I had an opportunity to get outside today, and it certainly made me yearn for being able to get back into both our parks that will be open and hopefully all of these sites that we'll be able to change the course of moving forward. So keep our fingers crossed, and hopefully post-COVID, we'll have a chance to see all of you out in a number of these sites. I want to just take a quick moment to thank Tara, Becky, Chris, Taylor, and the rest of our CPAWS staff for facilitating this session and providing an opportunity for all of us to have a greater say in what's been happening with regards to this parks announcement. So thanks to you guys. You've done a great job of putting this together. Very quickly, a little bit about myself. Like Chris, I also worked for parks. I did notice on the chats at the beginning, a number of you that I know from my years in the Park Service were saying hi, and so hi back to you. I couldn't get to everybody on the chat boxes, but nice to see you here tonight, and hopefully we'll have a chance during the Q&As to answer some of your questions. I had a 37-year dream career with Alberta Parks that ended only a couple of years ago. I retired in the fall of 2018, and I was lucky during that 37 years to have worked in several areas in the province, but also to have had the opportunity to have been the director for Kananaskis Country, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then also to have finished my career as the Assistant Deputy Minister and worked right across the province with all of our great staff in Alberta Parks, who I can tell you many of them are as concerned about this as we are. So we can go on to the next slide. I want to just touch on a couple of the details that Chris had talked about and try and be quite quick about this so we can get to the questions. First of all, what changes with a delisted site that they're talking about? Delisted, deregulated could be considered the same thing. If you look into the materials, you will realize there's 164 sites that have been identified for delisting, and the government indicates that those sites will be delisted one way or the other. It's not that they're asking us what we think, but in fact, those ones at this point are being considered to be moving forward for change in order in council to remove them from the park system. So what does that mean? In this case, that means that they would no longer fall under one of our pieces of protected area legislation. So there's 9 provincial parks, there's 149 provincial recreation areas, that's by far the biggest chunk, and 6 natural areas. And in Alberta, there's 3 pieces of what we would consider to be protected area legislation: the Provincial Parks Act, WRNA, which is the Wilderness Areas, Ecological Reserves, Natural Areas, and Heritage Rangelands Act. It's a big mouthful, and hopefully someday we'll be able to change that. And then, of course, the Wilmore Wilderness Act, which is at this point is not impacted by these particular decisions. What's unique about protected area legislation is that the primary intent is for conservation and outdoor recreation. Different from the Public Lands Act, as Chris had talked about, which is open to a much broader suite of potential uses. Once a site is delisted, then obviously Parks Act and regulations would no longer apply. So a conservation officer wouldn't be able to charge you under the Parks Act, for example, for an infraction that currently he might be able to on that particular designated piece of land. And it's likely that Parks Division would no longer be the land manager for that piece of land. It would more probably fall to the public lands managers within the regions who manage the remaining public land that falls across the province. So that would be a big change in that the Parks Division manages those lands with a specific intent in mind as it relates to managing a park system and all the components that go along with it. So that would be a fairly significant change. Next slide, please. So in most cases, as Chris had mentioned, the lands would revert back to public lands under the authority of the Public Lands Act. They would be subject to Public Lands Act and regulations and zones. There are not zones that are found across the province, but only in some specific areas. When I talk about zones, I talk about something like in Kananaskis Country, there's the Kananaskis Public Land Use Zone. In the Wipers area, for example, there is a public land use zone, which sets out some specific regulations on those public lands in those areas. But in a large part of the province, those specific zones have never been designated, which means there's very limited regulations under the Public Lands Act for managing a lot of the kinds of activities that occur on those lands that are outside those regulated zones. As Chris mentioned, there's a wider range of permitted recreational, agricultural in some cases, and industrial and tourism activities that could occur on those lands. So although some of those things happen in a parks context now, the difference being that those things that happen in a parks context happen in support of the park's objectives. That's not the case on public lands. On public lands, the particular objective associated with a lease or an agreement would be designed to support that particular activity rather than to meet the overall objectives of the park, for example. And in some cases, the lands could be sold or transferred to a third party, such as a municipality. So Chris mentioned this. We've recently seen a land sale in southern Alberta. The land sales auctions do happen. And so it wouldn't be unthinkable that sites that currently are parks could potentially be sold or transferred and no longer even be crown lands or public lands owned by the province. Okay, next slide, please. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was about partnerships. We've heard lots about these 164 sites. They're going to look for partners to manage these sites, to take them over and to provide services that either mimic what's there now or perhaps are something completely different. So first, I just want to talk about what happens currently in parks is that there are a number of partnerships now. So it's not like partnerships are not occurring there or are unique to areas only outside of parks. We have lots of them within parks. The difference being, as I mentioned before, is that the partnerships within parks are there to support the objectives and the outcomes of the parks underneath the protected area legislation. That's a really significant difference. So we have things like facility operating agreements. They're very common across the province. You know them in Kananaskis from a company like Kananaskis Camping. They provide those services on behalf of the government, but they provide them to a park standard under parks regulations and so forth. But they actually manage all of the facilities, maintain the revenue, and so forth. There's things like maintenance contracts, of course, which you'd be familiar with. Cooperating agreements are agreements that parks currently has with things like friends organizations, the Friends of Fish Creek or the Glenbow Ranch Foundation. And these are organizations that provide park services on behalf of parks through a nonprofit organization. And they're done through something that we call a cooperating agreement. And then finally, there are some long-term lease anomalies that do exist within parks. But again, the important piece there is that they are subject to the rules and regulations that are associated with under the Parks Act. And so examples of these might be the hotels at Kananaskis or Nikiska ski area are found within Bow Valley Provincial Park, for example. They're part of the park, and they are subject on their leases and on the hills. They have to have public access and so forth, a number of things like that that meet park objectives. Okay, next slide, please. So what would be the difference on a delisted site partnership that the government is talking about? Well, obviously park regulations and standards would no longer apply. So it would fall under the Public Lands Act. There would be a different set of standards that would be probably much broader with regards to other types of activities. Partners could enter into long-term leases for the sites. Now, I indicated we do have a few anomalies like that within the park system now, but in this case, it would be specifically for something like, might be a lease for a hotel site, and it wouldn't be subject to the guidelines or the regulations that you currently find underneath the Parks Act. Parks infrastructure could be, and in some cases most likely will be sold, and you'll lose that opportunity. Once that's sold, and belongs in private hands, it's going to be very difficult if Parks ever changes its mind, or if the government ever changes its mind and wants to go back and open that site and designate it once again. And so there is a likelihood that some of the park infrastructure could be sold. Lands could be sold. So as much as the minister has indicated that none of the lands will be sold in the early stages of this, if you saw the original news releases, in fact, it did include a reference to some of the lands potentially being sold. That has since been removed from any of the communications currently out there. But the lands, potentially some of them could be sold, particularly outside of the forest reserve. So in the white area of the province. So lands that are in the agricultural and industrial zones of the province. So we have lots of provincial sites out there that potentially those lands could be sold. And alternative management approaches will be considered. So this is something that Chris mentioned. One of the things that I know we have a big concern with is that the government has not adequately defined what they mean by alternate management approaches, how those would be determined, what the process would be for determining what criteria would be used to determine if something was satisfactory. Would there be a public consultation component that would be associated with that? And it could include new recreational, tourism, agricultural, industrial, or municipal uses that could be associated with those alternative management approaches, if that's what it takes for someone to enter into a partnership to take over responsibility for that land, if the opportunity is there. It's not inconceivable to think that there might be a municipality that is really interested in some new gravel resources, such as you see in the photo there, that could say, well, the site is underutilized, it's not providing great recreation value from our perspective, and we think that we'd like to actually change that use altogether and turn it into a gravel resource. That's not inconceivable at all. Let's go to the next photo. Okay, so one of the things I just wanted to quickly mention is that we've been here before. So some of you will perhaps remember in the early 2000s, Alberta Parks embarked on an ambitious program, not dissimilar to what we're doing right now. It was called Completing the Puzzle. And the idea was that we were going to be reviewing a whole bunch of sites, looking for potential partners, and then potentially delisting and downloading those sites to municipalities or others. There was very little success with that in 2004. There was one or two sites, as I recall, that actually did have that occur to, but a number of them did not. It's not surprising. Municipalities, businesses, and nonprofits at the time, they had very little capacity or desire to take on these provincial sites and to operate them and to run them. And perhaps most importantly, in 2004, similar to what we're doing here today, local citizens got in an uproar about sites that were important to them. And they spoke out loudly about the closures. They called their MLAs, and we had MLAs coming to us going, what the heck are you doing closing this site in my constituency that is so important to my local residents, that they use it, they don't want it to be gone. I didn't know about this. That was one of the refrains that we heard at the time. It happened too quickly. So we've been here before. It's not a surprise, and one would really hope that we could learn from some of our past mistakes. Okay, next slide. So that leads me back to why not ask Albertans what they think about this? And Chris alluded to the fact that there has not been any public consultation associated with the decision that came down. And I would like to point to the fact that Alberta's plan for parks, which granted is perhaps somewhat dated, it's 2009, but it is the only cabinet approved policy document, overall policy document for parks that is in existence today. And there was a component within that that spoke to giving that Albertans would have opportunities for meaningful input into decisions about parks, and the decision-making process would be inclusive and transparent. That obviously hasn't happened in this case. And what's interesting is in February, so maybe just to back up, following that plan for parks and that decree there, over the last number of years, Alberta Parks has actually put together a very robust consultation process that was advertised online on the website. Many of you were probably signed up to receive the regular notices about any consultations that would occur. The consultations would occur at different levels depending on what type of thing it was. But in any type of change to a park designation or park boundaries, like we're talking about now, under that process required a public consultation of 60 days, a minimum of 60 days online, and notification to stakeholders and groups to have occurred. In February, that suddenly changed on the website and it was taken down, and that requirement no longer exists. So it was funny, it kind of aligns with, you know, the coming announcement with regards to the parks, that they suddenly changed this consultation process, and they did that without any consultation, without any notification to anybody that this change was coming. So it's very disappointing, considering that this government did talk a lot during the election last year about being more open, transparent, and consulting with Albertans. And we certainly don't seem to be getting that in this case. As far as we know, there has been no consultation with Albertans, with First Nations, with the tourism industry, or with local municipalities with regards to the decision that has been made. So, you know, the next step might be what is the alternative management structure that's going to go along with this. But the fact is, the decision itself has been made, and there's been no consultation, as far as we can tell, that has occurred with any of these groups. And I would note, in the case of First Nations, that we have a legal duty to consult, and whether or not that process or threshold has been met in this case is something that we certainly don't know. That would have been an exercise done within government, but we'd sure love to see it. They provided no rationale for how the sites were selected, or any of the supporting data has not been provided as to why these particular sites. And I'm going to go back to my first slide in just a minute, just to talk quickly about that. And I just wanted to point out that Alberta Parks has always recognized the need for consultations on these types of changes. And just as a quick example of that and how it's changed from 2017-18 to 2020 is quite remarkable. In 2018, the Alberta Parks system went through a process of delisting Sylvan Lake Provincial Park. Now, I know some of you are probably sitting there right now going, what? Sylvan Lake Provincial Park doesn't exist anymore? Nope, it doesn't. It was divested by the park system in 2018, in the spring of 2018. It was divested to the town of Sylvan Lake. But I say it's an example of consultation done right, in that we spent almost a year doing consultation with local groups, with the local government. We did a full online consultation twice with Albertans before the decision was made to divest Sylvan Lake Provincial Park. It was a good example of a site where the town had grown completely around it. There was no ecological value associated really with the site anymore. It is a summer beach tied to the town. So you can understand why it made more sense for perhaps the town to take it over. But it was done in a way so that the town is going to be held. There's a caveat on the property that the town can only use it to provide recreation for that particular site. So it wasn't like it was just given away and going to have condos built on it. In fact, it remains park, but it remains as municipal park for the purpose of providing recreational access to the lake. So I would say that we have experience in doing this right, but we sure aren't doing it right this time around. And we need to back the train up and have a further conversation about where this piece is going. And I missed a point that I want to, if you can go back to my very first slide. And sorry about that. I know I'm going backwards here. I just wanted to point out something here because I know a number of folks that I've seen that are on the session tonight certainly will have an interest in what's happening in Kananaskis as it relates to this. And contrary to what's been reported, not all of these sites are low use, and many of them have some pretty significant ecological value. And just as an example, on the photograph that you see here, this is a photograph of Cataract Creek. It is just, the Cataract Creek campground is just off to the right here. This is looking down. It's obviously fairly high water for Cataract Creek this time of year, but it's looking downstream from Cataract Creek. It's adjacent to, it shares a common boundary with the Don Getty Wildland Park. And on any summer weekend when the weather is decent, I challenge anybody to get a site in the campground at Cataract Creek. It's a very busy location. It is a favorite haunt for me, but it's a favorite haunt for lots of Albertans who absolutely love that site. So I challenge this government to tell us how they made decisions with regards to a number of these sites, because they certainly don't fit the criteria what they put out there at this particular point in time. The other thing about Kananaskis, which I know a number of you have lots of concerns about, is there is a very large number of sites identified in Kananaskis for delisting. And if you look at the south end of Kananaskis, Highway 40 and 945-40 down through the Highwood, Alberta parks in the front country, so all of the little provincial recreation areas and campgrounds, Etherington, Cataract, and so forth, will no longer have parks will no longer have a presence in that part of Kananaskis country. Hard to imagine. And so with that, I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to move on to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was awesome, and I think it definitely answered a lot of the questions that were already in the chat box. So keep them coming, everyone. And we're going to move on to Christine O'Reilly. She's the Access and Environment Representative for the Alpine Club of Canada Calgary chapter, and she's going to provide us a perspective from some recreationalists. So on to you, Christine, if you're there.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me, Tara?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Great. Yeah, so as Tara mentioned, I'm with the local ACC, Alpine Club of Canada Calgary section, and I largely volunteer on the Access and Environment Committee, which is an area of the club that's dedicated to responsible recreation and stewardship. And I guess first and foremost, the ACC does not support the closure or loss of status of any of Alberta park lands. And as Chris and Steve mentioned, it's really easy to say that it's a small amount of land. You know, the number that we're hearing is 0.3% of Alberta parks by area, and therefore these aren't really considerable changes. But you know, it's 2020, and we also know that this goes against everything we've learned about biodiversity, habitat loss, ecosystem health, and all that good stuff. And if you want to look at some conservation numbers, you know, in Canada in the last 20 years, we've seen 66% increase in conserved land. In the last 5 years, we've seen a 6% increase in conserved land. So it's such a positive trend. It's hard to believe that Alberta would decide to go in such an opposite direction. It really doesn't make any sense, and it goes against all that science is saying about biodiversity and the need for more conservation generally. Also, each area on the closure list is unique, and it provides ecological and recreational value. I've only lived in Alberta for about 4.5 years, and in that short amount of time, I've seen parkland usage soar. Overcrowding in the parks is already quite apparent. And if we're going to further reduce available recreational areas, it's only going to cause further strain on the existing parklands and systems. And also, we think it sets a bit of a dangerous precedent for other jurisdictions if we let these changes come in without any consultation at all from the public. And we really don't want to see this become a trend. And I think some people probably feel that recreation groups like the ACC, our main goal is to promote the spirit of alpine and mountaineering and all that stuff, that we shouldn't be getting political, or that we should not be becoming an advocacy agency. But we're actually a really good vessel for that type of work, because we want to make sure that we're not only users of the land, but that we're also stewards of the land. And we really want to encourage other recreation groups to speak up on important issues like this. Our local section has been doing some actions to help draw awareness to the issue. So we promoted the town halls and the Defend Alberta Parks rally on our social media channels. And we also wrote a letter to the minister stating our opposition to the changes on behalf of the ACC Calgary section. And we represent about 2,000 members, so we're a pretty sizable group. On the national front, you may have noticed that we've been a bit quiet, but COVID-19 has really impacted staffing for the National Alpine Club. As you might have heard, our huts are closed right now, and that's our main source of revenue. They've been closed from mid-March, and they're going to be closed until mid-June. So that's hit us pretty hard. And just know that when things get back to normal, that we're going to be running more content and advocating to reverse the decision. And if you're a member of the Alpine Club, any section really, or if you're really a member of any recreation group at all, I really encourage you to reach out and let your executives know that this issue matters to you, and that our voice is louder together, and that maybe we should be becoming a little louder or getting a little more riled up about this issue, because it really is that important. And that's all I've come here to say tonight. Thanks so much for inviting me, Becky, and to give a little bit about the club's perspective on this issue.
Thank you so much for providing that, and I really like that last point. I hope everyone can get engaged and involved. So thank you for being a vessel for that, Christine, and to ACC as well. So next up, we have Becky. She's the engagement coordinator with our Southern Alberta chapter, and she is going to be giving you a rundown on how you can get involved and have your voice heard to speak out against these changes. So hopefully this will answer some questions, but again, we're getting lots of great questions in the chat, so please keep them coming. Over to you, Becky.
Tara. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to Chris and Steve and Christine for laying out all the different ways these cuts are impacting us.
Sorry, Becky, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. I'm getting a lot of feedback on your mic. I'm not sure if others are too. I don't know if there's something you can adjust there.
Is that okay? Still a lot of feedback?
Still a fair amount. And I'm getting that other people are receiving this also.
Is that okay?
No, I'm not sure what this is. Sorry, everyone. Just give us 1 second. Some people are suggesting that it's aliens. Which...
Yeah, probably.
Oh, there, that's much better.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah.
I just
Wonderful.
won't touch my headphones at all.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that, everybody. They did see those UFOs, though, the other day, so that's likely what it was. Yeah, just before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining everybody from Calgary tonight, which is in Treaty 7, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations, and Métis Region 3 as well. These are many of my favorite places are in these areas, and many of the places we've been talking about tonight fall in these territories. So I'm going to be talking about how we can raise our voices most effectively. And you've been asking great questions about that in the chat already, so hopefully I can address those. There are a bunch of actions out there that we're encouraged to take on a daily basis, and it's kind of hard to understand which have the most impact and which are the best to spend your time and efforts on. So Taylor's just going to launch a quick poll, and we're really curious about what folks have been doing out there. So what actions have you taken at home? Have you signed an online petition? Have you sent an online form letter? Have you sent a personal letter? Have you called your MLA or the minister, or have you had a meeting with any of these folks? Cool. Yeah, so we're seeing a lot with online petition, online letter as well. Quite a few personal letters and phone calls. Just 2 people, 3 people have met with their MLAs. There's a pretty good spread, but I would say the majority are in online petition and online letter. So Taylor, you can end that poll whenever you like. Yeah, we can go to the next slide as well. So yeah, not all actions are created equal. A general rule that I use when deciding what action to take is the more personal and the more detailed it is, the more impact it will have. So this is just like a rough ladder I've created, and it has online petitions at the bottom, and it has meeting with your MLA at the very top of impact level. Adding your name alongside thousands of others on an online petition doesn't really explain to decision makers who you are and why you care about the issue, or even if you live in their riding. On the other hand, if you take the time to write a detailed email, or if you have a phone conversation with your MLA, it can have much more of an impact. You can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk about all of these actions in a little more detail. So there's a lot of confusion about petitions and how useful they are. So first of all, in Alberta, petitions to the Legislative Assembly, just to explain what they are means by which member of the public may bring certain issues to their attention, to the attention of the legislature. They have to be hard copy and they have to be pretty specifically worded. And even when they are formulated and presented properly, they're not binding. And of course, COVID has made it really unsafe to collect a whole bunch of hard copy signatures right now. In Alberta, online petitions are not accepted in the legislature, and governments are in no way obligated to formally acknowledge them. However, an online petition can signal to media and government about roughly how many people care about a certain issue, but they're not accepted formally in the legislature. So I would say in this case, they're not really the most impactful way forward. Next slide, please. Writing a letter. So there's two ways that the majority of people send letters. First, there's the form letter, which lots of you folks have done. Lots of you might have sent the form letter through the CPAWS website. This is a quick way to send a letter directly to the specific decision maker and let them know where you're writing from when you put your postal code in. And it takes about the same amount of time it would to sign an online petition. Organizations like us prep these to make it easy for people to understand the issue, add a lot of detail, and make it really convenient to make sure you're sending it to the right people. They're a good way to get a bunch of letters sent. However, the downside is that a bunch of identical form letters don't really make as big of an impact as personal letters do. Personal letters, they take a bit more time. And I know that everybody feels the need to be an expert when you're talking to a politician, but I would like to emphasize they're not an expert in the issue, so you definitely do not need to be an expert when you send a letter to your MLA. All that your MLA needs to know is why you care about the issue, tell them how the decision impacted you, why you agree or disagree with it, and what they should do to fix it. They're accountable to you, and they can't know how you feel unless you reach out to them directly. Next slide, please. Making a call or having a meeting are 2 easy ways, again, to create a personal connection and let decision makers know what you care about. So when you make a call, it's a really quick one. I always do it because I don't like staring at my screen and writing emails. So I just pick up the phone. Sometimes I'll talk to staff. The majority of time, I'll leave a message. All you have to do is quickly introduce yourself, say what you're calling about, where you're calling from, what your concerns are, and ask for a follow-up. If you've sent them a letter and haven't received a response, making a quick phone call to the office can be a great way to remind them that you're still out there and you still care. Having a meeting with your MLA is a great way to follow up on a letter or call. It takes a lot more time than the other actions, of course, and it can seem a little intimidating. But these days, all meetings are taking place over phone or Zoom, so it would end up just being like a 20-minute phone conversation, probably. However, you know, like I said, it can seem intimidating, but the same rules apply. You do not need to be a policy expert. You tell them your story, why you care about parks, why you're impacted by these cuts, and they can't argue with you about those facts. And of course, if you feel the need to have facts and research to back you up, you can always come to us. We're always doing research, and we have lots of expertise on this issue that we're happy to share. Next slide, please, Taylor. So amplifying your impact. When you send your email or make a phone call, it's easy to feel like it just kind of ended there and like, what good is it? And that it can feel even worse when you're ignored. My MLA has blacklisted me and refuses to answer any of my emails, and it can be a little disheartening. But it's really important to remember that when you decide to take one of these actions, somebody still has to answer the phone, somebody still has to read the email, somebody still writes down what people's concerns are. And then this feedback goes to the minister. This feedback goes to the MLAs. And many MLAs and other politicians assume that if you send them your thoughts on an issue, that many others feel the same way that you do. I once had an MLA tell me that when they received an email or a letter or a call about an issue, they would assume that there's at least 5 other people who feel the same way and just didn't take the time to reach out. So the 10 minutes you spend sending an email could have a pretty big impact. Your efforts are significantly multiplied. Another way you can amplify your impact is reaching out to your network. So this is kind of what Christine was talking about already. Think about all the other people in your life who are upset by these cuts but don't know what to do next. These could be family members, hiking buddies, club members like the ACC, and your influence could have a big impact on them. Share information with them, tell them what you learned tonight, show them that calling your MLA isn't that scary, and post about it on social media. All of these actions have a huge impact and can encourage more of us to make our voice heard and feel less alone with this issue. Yeah, and that's it from me. You can go to the next slide, Taylor. So next steps, what can you do? You can support our work at CPAWS. You can sign up for our emails, you can donate, you can hit the keyboards and the phones, talk to family and friends about this, and you can stay up to date on information about the cuts and new ways you can raise your voice at this link on the screen, and we can also pop that in the chat for you as well. Yeah, and back to Tara.
All right, thank you very much, Becky. Sorry if I didn't get to acknowledging your question in the chat. You guys were furious away with those questions, so I was just trying to capture them all. Yeah, so now we get to move on to the fun part, question and answer. I'm going to select some of the many questions that people have asked and then select one of the presenters to answer those questions. But first, I've had a couple questions about either sharing the slides or the points with their MLA or just the content that's available or how people can take action. So in the chat right now, I am going to just send you guys all of those links so that everyone has it on hand. And then we will get started. So one of the first questions, or not one of the first questions, one of the great questions that we received, we are going to direct to Steve, if you're ready. So the question is, oh gosh, where did it go? Both of them are actually surrounding Kananaskis. So maybe we can flip to the next slide, which I believe has the map of all of the affected sites in Kananaskis, which is quite stark. And they're kind of related. So the first question is, my concern is, what are the plans for the land that has become privatized? I am especially concerned about the Kananaskis area, but all areas would this mean that they could develop it, for example, with oil and gas? And then the next question that's kind of related is, with no municipalities or nonprofits operating in Kananaskis, what options would exist for management of the delisted spots in Cape Country?
That's a big question. We could probably spend all night just on that, but
Maybe just 1 minute?
So a couple of things. One, I'm not sure with the reference to private lands exactly what's being referred to in the question, because there are the only private lands that are held within Kananaskis country at this point are the Burns properties in the Upper Sheep.
The question is asking, is saying like, if there's no municipalities or nonprofit that are taking it on and it reverts back to it's either sold or becomes public land, I think that is like what could happen on that vacant public land or if it's privatized.
Right. And so what could happen on those lands in Kananaskis country would be subject to a couple of things. One is there's a public land use zone in place for Kananaskis country that dictates some of the activities, particularly from a recreational perspective. So at this point where you can use off-highway vehicles, for example, where you can use snowmobiles, is dictated under that set of regulations under the public land use zone for Kananaskis country. And then there is, in addition to that, the Kananaskis recreation policy, which was created in 1999. So it's, again, it is dated, but it was a government policy at the time, and as far as I know, is still in effect, which limits the type of, from a recreational perspective, the type of development that could occur in Kananaskis country to small scale fixed roof accommodations, campgrounds, those kinds of things, and they have to be associated with an existing management plan before they can move ahead. So there are a couple of documents there. The bigger concern, particularly when you look at a number of these sites in the south part of Kananaskis country, and the ones along Highway 66 there in the north as well, is that they all fall under either some community timber permits or under Spray Lake Sawmills FMA. And so if they were to revert back to public land, my assumption would be then that they would then fall into the purview of those existing tenures that occur within Kananaskis now. And so there would be some potential that those sites, if facilities were removed and nobody took them over to operate them, which is hard to imagine who would, because there, as you say, there isn't a true existing municipality in Kananaskis country that would take them over. It actually is Parks Division, designated by the minister in the improvement district. That some of those sites, if they have any timber value on them, potentially could be a site that could be added into an annual allocation under one of those tenures.
All right, thank you for that. And we just got a comment that said that answered it very well. Thank you from the person that posed the question. So my next question is going to go to Chris, if you're still on.
Yep.
And the question is, have there been any developments or changes in the government plans since March?
So the government, other than the slight changes that the Environment Minister made to clarify certain parts of the announcement, mainly that the land when the Crown land wouldn't be sold, just the assets on that land. Outside of that, to my knowledge, there's been no changes from that original announcement.
Awesome, thank you. One more question for Chris. Your number 11 referred to parks usage. I mean, this could be Chris or Becky. Parks usage, and the question is, does the public have access to the data referred to in that slide? So that was the slide that referred to low usage of the areas.
Just to clarify, are they asking if that information is publicly available, like the visitation numbers are publicly available?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there hasn't been kind of Alberta Park system-wide accounting of visitation that really captures all of the sites, probably since about 2006, I think is the latest publicly available information that I've been able to find on any of it. And having talked to others, there's summaries. So there's the annual report from Alberta Environment and Parks, but those only give very high-level aggregate numbers. They don't actually break down the individual park visitation numbers. So to answer your question, no, the data which the government would have used to determine whether these sites were underused or not is not publicly available, or debatably if it exists or not.
Awesome, thank you very much for answering that. I'm gonna ask my next question for Becky. And what is your advice for talking to your MLA if they are on side with you?
Yeah, thanks. I would also just like to add to Chris's answer for the previous one,
yes.
is that we have filed a request to see if any of that data exists. So CPAWS is looking for whatever rationale they did use.
We did just get a couple questions about whether or not there's been any freedom of information requests, and yes, we have a couple.
We're working on it. They're fun to work on. But yeah, talking to your MLA if they're already on side. So of course, opposition MLAs can be important advocates in the legislature. I would like to add though too, when we're looking at this map, and you guys are probably like me, many of your favorite areas are actually in rural places. And those are often UCP MLAs, right? So I think it's really important that the MLAs whose ridings these areas are in know that we're upset about this. So like, for example, Steve's example of Cataract Creek, I go out there a lot. And when I go out there, I stop in Black Diamond, which is RJ Sigurdsson Highwoods riding. And then I sometimes will go further south down on 22, which is Roger Reed's riding. I think it's really important for those MLAs to know that how you feel about what's happening in their riding, even if you don't live there. So I do think talk to your MLA if they're an NDPer, and get them to advocate for you. But I also think like spread the net a little wider if you've already had a conversation with them.
Thanks very much, Becky. I think you answered a couple of the other questions that were directed at you, is just what else can people do if they've already written a letter, etc. So don't give up, we are making a difference. So thanks everybody. Next question is for Steve. With all the effort that it takes to create a park or protected area, including the planning, consultation, and infrastructure investment, has Parks ever qualified the value or the financial value of the investment in the area? And the comment being that it would likely dwarf the $5 million in savings that is being claimed here.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. It's a really good question. And Chris alluded to a study that's been done by the Canadian Parks Council that talks about for every $1 of investment into parks, there's a $6 return to the GDP. That was work that was done, I think, around 2012, something like that, because I recall when it was being done. But there's two other studies that were done here in Alberta as well, and there's one that Parks actually still even places on their website. At least it was there a couple of weeks ago. I mean, perhaps it's been moved now too. That makes a reference to the economic impact of parks in Alberta. And between those two pieces, those two studies that were done, one by Alberta Tourism, and I can't recall the author on the other one, numbers between $500 million and $1 billion annually in direct and indirect economic activity that's generated as a result of parks, and about $200 million as a result of economic activity generated as a result of Kananaskis country. Is significant. So when I say indirect, so a big part of that is when Becky goes out to Cataract for the day and stops in Black Diamond, she goes to the bakery. I'm sure you go to the bakery in Black Diamond because I know how good it is. And you stop and get gas at a gas station along the way, and then you're really having a good time and you decide to spend the night in Longview, and on it goes. Those are all spin-off costs to the economy as a result of entering and going and enjoying the park spaces that we have. And it's pretty hard to tie those to any one specific site, but you can certainly tie it back to the activity that's occurring. And we know that it's very, very significant, and that a loss of this number of sites, I don't think there's been any business planning done that we're aware of that would give us any kind of idea of what the impact of the loss of these sites would be from an economic perspective as it relates to change in business, people not going, people no longer being interested. You know, those sites, again, I hate to dwell on Kananaskis, but that loop along the south end of Highway 40 and Highway 540 is one of the most spectacular drives anywhere in the Canadian Rockies. And those sites lend themselves to the nuance of what that experience is when you drive down Highway 40 and you stop at Lynham Creek to have a picnic lunch, and you stop at Highwood Pass to hike up to Ptarmigan Cirque, and then you do something else during the day, or you cycle that route, which I do often because I am a very avid biker. Those things all add to that experience, but it's hard to quantify any one specific site and how important it might be as it relates to, you know, that activity that's generated. The other piece that really is hard to calculate into that is the whole impact and contribution of ecosystem services that are provided by our parks and protected areas. And lots of people have been doing research on that. There's lots of stuff out there, but it's really, again, it's difficult to quantify, but the importance of it is immeasurable. You know, the clean drinking water that is provided to the city of Calgary, and the same thing for the city of Edmonton with our headwaters that come from the Bighorn, for example. So I'm not sure if that gets entirely at the question, but the bottom line is there's a huge economic impact of the activity that occurs within parks right now, and not just for the parks themselves, but for the services that are provided. You know, and one of the ones, cross-country skiing in Peter Lougheed Park, which is going to be terminated this fall. There's 1,000 people out there or more on a weekend cross-country skiing, and those 1,000 people are all stopping at little stores, restaurants, and gas stations when they go out for the day to participate in that sport. And nobody's thought about that. Or they're renting skis from the only ski rental shop at the Kananaskis Village. So anyways.
Thank you for that. So my next question is twofold, I guess. And I would like to open the opportunity to Chris, and then maybe Christine, if you have an opportunity to pitch in. So one of the questions was, has there been any consideration for the impacts that this closure of our parts of our park system would have on other park systems that are already at capacity? For example, BC parks across the border or our national parks.
So I don't have any hard data to support, so this is like pretty much solely my opinion on this. But I would say absolutely. People are still going to continue camping. And whether that means they turn to random camping or are pushed to more of the remaining sites. So we would get a higher amount of people going to a fewer amount of sites in Alberta, or we get spillover into, as you mentioned, either to the BC parks, which Albertans already frequent to a degree, as well as the national parks, which, as I imagine most people know, especially Banff and Jasper, are already, some would say, bursting at the seams with the amount of visitors traveling to them already, let alone how these park closures will impact those. So I guess to answer your question, yes, it is likely that there will be spillover effect to other areas with these closures. To what degree? It's kind of up in the air. It's hard to guess at that, but it will have to my mind, it will have a detrimental impact on those other sites. If people are going to sites that are already at or near capacity.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, very concerning on that. So kind of on the same line, I guess Steve Christine, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Chris said, obviously we don't have any data to back this up. So, you know, right now we're just going on what we experience within the club and opinions, but I would say that, yeah, I mean, it's definitely not going to have a positive impact on parks that are adjacent to, like, a lot of the BC park areas or the national parks. Even with in our own club, in the hut system, which is all throughout the national parks and BC park systems, you know, up to 13 months out, all of these hut systems are completely booked. So to say that the systems are already overloaded is an understatement, and to reduce recreational areas that are available to more localized areas definitely is not going to be a benefit to the system overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. All of our systems are heavily used, and we already know Albertans love parks and getting outside and the recreation. So it's going to be a big change for them. So on kind of that topic, either Chris or Steve, do you know of any examples of park networks that have been closed in other provinces or countries and the impacts that has had? Or examples of their success in not being closed?
Do you want to give this one a go, Steve? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. There were, I don't know about necessarily being closed, although I think there certainly were some sites that were closed a number of years ago in New Brunswick. And New Brunswick separated essentially their recreation and park sites from their park system, and they became part of a different department entirely, just focused on providing recreation access to beachfronts for the most part, and then separated from the management of other park systems, their wilderness areas and natural areas that occur in the province. And I don't know all of the details, but I do recall at the time that there was real concern was raised in New Brunswick about when that change took place, for some of the same reasons. And it wasn't because they're necessarily closing the sites, but it was felt that a number of the beach sites also had high conservation value, and that high conservation value was no longer being legislated under the same act, and wasn't going to be protected in the same way that it was when it was included within the protected area system as a whole. And again, there's some nuance there that I'm probably not hitting on, but you know, that's one example that I can think of for sure. And then of course in Alberta, you know, there have been some sites that have been closed, and there have been attempts to do some of this before, and it was not very successful in that there was a real outcry, largely from local communities, about, you know, sites that were important to them, regardless of whether or not they made a huge contribution to the provincial system. But the fact is that they were really important to local communities where, you know, the church held its picnic on Sunday afternoons, or, you know, that kind of thing. And some of those were going to be lost. So I'm not sure if I can, you know, there have been lots of changes in park systems across the country, you know, over the years, but I'm not sure if I have a really good example. I don't know, Chris, if you can think of anything else.
Yeah, so we were curious about this too. So we actually threw that question out to our other chapters across Canada. We have essentially a chapter in every province, and all of them basically said that there's never been in any of their provinces a divestment of park assets to this scale in any of their histories. Mm-hmm. I think BC or New Brunswick was the closest example, and you kind of elaborated on that, Steve. But outside of that, this is, to my knowledge, the largest or the most extensive, I would say, divestment of park assets among any of the provinces.
Yeah, and keep in mind that that's very different from privatization, in which case where the province maintains control of the assets. That's happened a lot of places across the country. So southern Quebec with CPAC, and in British Columbia, of course, where there are campground operators that work for the park work for parks, but they're contractors, to the department. So there's lots of that, but not actually of divesting of the facilities themselves.
Thank you guys for answering that. Appreciate it. So we have gone over time a little bit because there's been so many fantastic questions. So I think I'm going to wrap up by answering a couple questions on how people can help reverse these changes or stop these changes. So I'm going to point these to Becky. And so the first one here is, how do we get these proposed changes reversed? Is it worth meeting with park staff or just politicians?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's important to remember that a lot of folks who work for parks probably feel the same way we do. Like Steve and Chris here, they started working for parks because they want to protect the environment and, for all Albertans. And so also, if you're thinking about talking to park staff, remember that the department has been undergoing significant budget cuts and they're under a lot of stress, and often them getting involved in anything politically could put them in jeopardy with job security. So I think there are allies in working for the park system, but also we don't want them to be getting in any kind of trouble. So I do think the ones that hold the decision-making power, or the ones who can put pressure on the environment minister, are other MLAs, and specifically MLAs in Calgary, I think is a really important pressure point because it's mostly UCP members, and Calgarians are overwhelmingly affected by these cuts, as we can see by the cuts in Kananaskis. So I would advise, if you live in Calgary, really, really go for it and really try to put pressure on your MLAs.
Thanks, Becky. Sorry, I was just getting lots of little chats there. It is also worthwhile, talking to park staff, I think, to voice that you have concerns, for sure, if you are having those conversations. But I think in this instance, yeah, it's more meaningful to reach out to our elected representatives. So the last couple questions that we had were around how you can take action. As Becky laid out in her presentation, there are lots of ways. I also, way back in the chat, which you guys should be able to see, included a link to our action page. And then the last question I think we're gonna ask for the night, because it feels nice, is what is the best way for groups to support CPAWS?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Tara. I think Christine set a really good example tonight. I think lots of groups, especially recreation groups, are scared of getting political on certain issues, but I think it's really important to remember that this issue really transcends politics, in my opinion. I think people across the political spectrum, well, I know people across the political spectrum support having parks and support having access to recreation and conservation in our province. So if you're a leader of a recreation group, I think it's important to step up and take a stand against this. Ways you can do that are sending a letter to government on behalf of your organization. And additionally, something that I didn't mention in my presentation, but writing a letter to the editor in your local paper too, that has a lot of impact. It signals to others reading that they're not the only one and other people feel like them. And our politicians do read the papers, they do read the letters to the editors, and to gauge how the public feels about certain issues. So that would be my advice for groups who want to support us and want to get this change reversed.
And I would just chip in too, just educate your friends and family on this. I'm sure everybody on this call has someone, either a friend or family member, who also cares about this issue very greatly. And just, as talking about people that you're a trusted voice, and that's a great way to just organically spread the word. A lot of people still don't even know that this is really happening, or if it is happening, to what extent and what it actually entails. So definitely please take what you've gathered from this this town hall, use the links and the resources that we provided links to or that you've been able to find, and just talk with people, get other people calling their MLAs, get other people submitting their thoughts to their elected representatives, and it can really snowball.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. So on that, I would invite Christine and Steve to each provide just a closing thought if you have one. And then I think we'll wrap it up.
Am I on? Oh, yes.
You're on.
Well, I want to say thanks to everybody for participating again tonight. It was a great turnout. There's obviously lots of interest. It's an incredibly important issue, and the timing, I don't know if it could have been better or could have been worse, falling in the middle of this COVID issue that we have going on, around the world. But in some ways, that has really highlighted the importance of our park spaces to all of us, and especially when we're missing them right now. But I would encourage everybody, as Becky has said, get out, make your voice heard, speak to your MLA. I can't tell you how important that is. From my role as an assistant deputy minister and meeting regularly with my minister, I can tell you that those voices are heard and they are very important. And as you know, in this province, there's often very small but vocal minorities of folks that make change, and they make that change because they speak loudly. And so I think it's our turn to speak loudly, and we're not even a minority. We know that all Albertans agree with us, so go forth.
Thank you, Steve. Christine, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
Not too much to add. Steve had a very good closing, rallied troops there. Just to say that if you're someone who typically, you tend to be more of a quiet person, or you just sit and listen, stand at the back kind of person, that there still is room for your voice in this topic, and they need to hear all of our voices. I am typically one of those people. I don't like public speaking. That's why my camera's still off. But the issue matters a lot to me. So I've decided that this is something that I should become vocal for. And if you feel that way, then I really encourage you to do the same.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for speaking publicly on this issue. We really appreciate it. Your voice is very valuable. With that, everyone, I just wanted to say thank you for taking so much of your time out of this very lovely evening. At least in Edmonton, it's been really nice out. And we also just greatly appreciate how many of you, not just on this call, but across all of the different activities that we've done and people we've spoken to, how many people that even during a pandemic are speaking up and defending Alberta's parks. And so that means a lot, and I'm really optimistic that we are going to be able to reverse these changes and keep these parks in our park system so that they're there for us to enjoy when it becomes safe for us to do so again. So thank you, everybody. We will be sending out an email to all registered participants, and that will have some of the links that we talked about. We've had a lot of questions about maps or lists, etc. So we'll include those things as resources in an email if you didn't quite catch them in the chat. And if you do have any additional questions, I know we couldn't get to all of them today. We're hopefully going to compile them and be able to answer them somehow online. But if you do have any more for us, please send us a message on social media or send us an email. Just reach out in any way that you want to. And with that, we will say good night. So thanks everybody for joining, and thank you so much to all of our presenters. You guys were amazing. So, and if there's interest, we're gonna keep engaging with people this way, because we like it. So thank you very much, everybody.